to the Pro Bono Happy Hour. I'm Rena Glazer. Welcome back. Today's guest is Liz Markuci from an organization called Volunteers of Legal Service, or VOLS, V-O-L-S, VOLS. VOLS' mission is to leverage the goodwill, resources, and talents of New York City's leading law firms to provide pro bono legal assistance to low-income New Yorkers. VOLS was founded in 1984 in the wake of developments that echo current events. Reagan-era budget cuts squeezed legal services from two sides. On the one hand, cuts to assistance programs increased the demand for civil legal aid. And on the other hand, cuts in funding for legal services programs dramatically reduced the supply. VOLS works closely with hospitals, schools, senior centers, and other community organizations to integrate pro bono legal assistance into the array of services these organizations already provide. For example, they help mothers in prison maintain visitation with their children. They help senior citizens with advanced healthcare directives and other essential life planning documents. They help children with asthma by forcing landlords to eradicate mold. Liz is the director of their immigration project. We hope you enjoy our conversation. Hi, Liz. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in. So could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to VOLS?
Certainly, yes. I graduated from CUNY Law School just a little over a decade ago. I can't believe how much time has flown by. So I knew even before I went to law school that I wanted to work in the public interest field. And that very much informed my sort of research into law schools that would support that pathway. Initially, I wasn't sure what area of law would be my focus, but I did have a really wonderful opportunity at CUNY to explore various areas in the public interest field while I was a student there. So I spent a semester, learning about community economic development and legal strategies to work on those issues. And then I spent a summer interning at a member-led community advocacy group in Brooklyn, which is now called Make the Road, and does a lot of work that connects legal services and advocacy and is really driven by the members themselves that are part of the community. And I thought that was a really interesting model. And so we were exploring those types of ways that lawyers can support bigger movements to get justice, access to justice for groups of people that are not always able to do that. And I also spent a semester representing claimants who were denied public benefits at administrative hearings, and I got to do that in my second year as part of the very well-recognized clinical program at CUNY. And so I don't know if that's something that I don't think every law student gets a chance to have clients and go and appear in front of an administrative law judge already in second year. So I had a lot of hands-on interaction with different areas of public interest law. That summer I interned at the Housing Unit of Legal Services New York. And then finally, my final year, I was sort of wavering between potentially international human rights law and immigrant rights. And so I took a course in international human rights law and then did my final year in the immigrant rights clinic, where I got to go to immigration court and represent an asylee that was facing removal, who was a young child. And so I think that helped me hit the ground running when I finished law school, so I could, I had a lot of the skill sets that helped me work in this field. I decided to pursue immigration exclusively, not only because I really felt that my own personality and sort of the way I could interact with clients sort of was better suited my temperament, my interest in storytelling and working with people to advocate for themselves. And it sort of was a real hands-on application of the international human rights law in some contexts, in terms of refugee and asylum law, rather than sort of a lot of sometimes the more theoretical areas that you can work in the international human rights field. So when I finished, I was sort of trying to seek an opportunity to work in the immigration law field and ended up at a small private immigration firm for a couple of years. And it was actually through my own pro bono contributions when I was at that firm that led me to my position at Vols. So while I was learning sort of the nuts and bolts of immigration law with a firm that had been practicing for 20 or 30 years, I realized I wanted to devote more time in my spare time to be working on clients who can't afford to pay for private immigration legal services. And I started volunteering with the New York chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And it was through the work that I was doing in evenings, volunteering at clinics in a variety of locations in New York City, that I was introduced to one of the board members of Vols, who informed me that they were sort of looking to expand the project here on the immigration field. And it sort of naturally led organically to me starting at Vols part-time and then developing a project that grew into a full-time position and now has 3 staff members.
Thank you for sharing. That's a great story. Before we move on, could you do a little commercial for your law school? So CUNY, for people who aren't familiar, what we're saying is CUNY.
Right. It's the City University of New York, and it's a public interest law school. It was founded under those principles. I read the bios of all the professors there, and a lot of them had been involved in either landmark cases that affected really important areas of different types of public interest areas over the years. And so, I wanted to be in an environment that supported and developed the skills necessary to do that kind of work.
So you mentioned that even in choosing a law school, and even before, you knew that you wanted to work in the public interest, that you had a passion for access to justice. What do you think in your background or your personality sparked that interest?
I think I probably have quite a few examples even from my childhood. I think your history and your background does sometimes inform those choices that you make. And so I am the child of immigrants. They actually immigrated to Canada. Well, my mom came to the United States, but then ended up in Canada. And I'm also the daughter of a minister. And my family fled an oppressive and authoritarian government. And so as a child, I grew up around people where these were issues that were discussed in my household. My dad helped refugees entering Canada. So those values run deep in my family, and those are the things that have always been important to me. And I think on the flip side, in terms of my skills and my temperament, why it ended up, I could have easily gone into social work perhaps because of my gregarious nature and my ability to listen to other people and my empathy. However, I also perhaps was a little argumentative as a child and a teenager. And I know I got into a lot of debates or arguments, either, fighting for my siblings or kids at school against people I felt were bullying them. And I remember someone in my family was going, if you like arguing so much, maybe you should become a lawyer. And of course, my response was, maybe I will. And flash forward, here we are. And I do feel right now, we're really feeling an intense culture of bullying, not just the clients that I'm hearing from that are absolutely being affected by the climate in the country and how that's shifted in a really dangerous way these days, but also in terms of, a government that's trying to bully lawyers into not standing in their way or in his way. And so I think more important than ever, we need people who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right.
Well, the profession is lucky to have you as a member.
Oh, thank you. That's really sweet. I mean, I'm not alone. There are so many people that do so much amazing work, and I'm constantly overwhelmed and impressed by the level of commitment that people have to doing this work. And I think on another personal scale, I grew up in a family that definitely struggled financially, and I know that, as my parents were learning English and trying to navigate this new country and these new systems, there were a lot of things in our lives that could have been different or could have been made, there could have been less hardship if we had access to information that a lot of times low-income families or immigrant families don't have. And so it took a while for me to sort of reach the point where all of that background and sort of the natural trajectory of where I'm at now and what my childhood and my teenage years and all of those experiences sort of culminated in me really feeling and I feel very lucky to be in the position that I'm in and have an opportunity to do this work that is informed by those experiences and tries to be thoughtful about them as we try to leverage access to legal services as a community.
Before we laser focus on your immigration work, let's just talk a little bit about Vols, sort of the elevator speech, the what's the group's mission, and a little bit about the overview of its various projects.
So Vols was founded in 1984, I think on May 1st, and this was during another period of time when the government was threatening and actually defunding a lot of legal service providers. There was massive funding cuts. And I do want to alert all the listeners that is in the works again now, and we've made so much progress since then. And this is really going to hurt a lot of the families that the services that are provided by legal services organizations are really critical to quality of life issues like housing, public benefits, immigration. But at the time, partners at law firms in New York, and I believe the president of the New York City Bar, sort of got together and formed Vols. And this was at a time when pro bono was not what it is today. You had to really work on convincing people the value of doing pro bono, but the intention was to use the massive resources of the firms to sort of bridge the gap between the funding that was being lost at legal services and try to engage more pro bono lawyers at these firms to help New York City residents that were facing a lot of housing issues and different types of issues. And so that's sort of the long ago history of Vols. And so Vols really was a very tiny organization that was, working with firms to leverage their resources and provide pro bono legal assistance to a variety of low-income residents in New York City. And so over the last 30 years, Vols has had a variety of small projects that have tried to address those gaps that aren't being filled by the services that are funded by direct service representation by providers like Legal Aid or different organizations of that nature. And so our services are free, and one of the things we pride ourselves on is that we support the law firms to do that work and provide high-quality legal services and really give that mentoring and support to those firms that maybe don't have a lot of internal expertise on a variety of issues that New Yorkers are facing. And those include matters that range from immigration, housing, and we have a microenterprise project that helps entrepreneurs and supports CBOs and community economic development. We work with, especially in the last few years when there was a lot of unemployment and individuals that are being denied unemployment benefits, that was a newer project that we launched at Vols to help people fight those denials, and another project that works with incarcerated mothers to preserve their parental rights, and a life planning documentation preparation for the elderly. And so we've been really striving to bring pro bono legal assistance directly to the clients, to go out into those communities, doing Know Your Rights presentations at nursing homes or in schools or out in the prisons, and that way that New Yorkers can access legal help when and where they need it most in familiar settings where maybe they already have access to other services. And, we try to do this by building partnerships with senior centers or schools, hospitals, jails, and other community organizations that serve populations that maybe don't have a provider in their neighborhood, and that maybe organizations that lack the capacity to provide those services on site.
That's really helpful background. And let's switch gears a little bit and talk about you and what you do. As the director of the Immigration Project, how do you spend your time?
My project came out of another project. So I initially came to Vols to help support a children's project that was partnering law firms with schools. And they were seeing a variety of different legal issues, and immigration kept coming up. And what I started to perceive was a real need to provide free legal services on immigration issues specifically that may disrupt a young person's education. And so we have young people who might have the ability to regulate their status, or parents who are nervous about their rights or have been defrauded. And so we started establishing partnerships with 20 New York City high schools to provide ongoing free legal services and trainings and presentation to create more awareness about the issues for families that can't afford lawyers. So we would do staff trainings at schools and out in the community. So I'm definitely a part of doing those things. And I also recruit, train, and mentor volunteer lawyers so that they can be providing high-quality legal services. And these are sometimes individuals who don't know that they have a legal remedy available to them, are afraid to actively seek out other types of assistance. And so our model is proactively going into the community and seeking out people who want to either obtain immigration benefits or retain them. And so I'm constantly trying to think of ways to identify individuals that aren't coming forward for help, that really haven't, availed themselves of opportunities that sometimes they're going to lose if they don't talk to a lawyer in time. So we support some of our clients in becoming citizens, either through naturalization and derivation, and anyone who's wanting to affirmatively regulate their status through family members or other humanitarian forms of relief, like special immigrant juvenile status. So when I'm developing those opportunities for pro bono clients, I'm trying now to supervise. We had an equal justice fellow with us, luckily, for 2 years, and we've been able to keep her on as a staff attorney. So she's now doing some of that outreach work that I used to do. And now I'm trying to look at, identifying the unmet needs of the populations that we serve. I serve on committees that are trying to improve the practice of law in this field. So I'm on panels where I'm developing CLEs and trainings connected to ethics or cultural competency, and then the actual nuts and bolts of immigration law that is quite a wide range of topics. So I wear a lot of different hats.
And there are only so many hours in the day. So
yes.
is there anything that you wish you could be doing more of? If you had an endless supply of time, are there things that you wish you could be focusing on or spending your time doing?
I wish that I could take more time to write about the lessons that we've learned or share these success stories, because I do think that, we don't even take time often to acknowledge this wonderful case. And it's always on my to-do list, but then there's someone else who desperately needs help. And so I always prioritize the next thing that we need to get placed, or we need to vet, or we need to do background work on. And so there's a part of me that wishes I had time to sort of help share my perspective, or work with a client to share their story if they want, some support to be able to talk about what it meant for them to have access to legal assistance, and really help shape the narrative of why this work is important on a micro level instead of sort of a broad level, because I do think that's more effective in terms of storytelling, and I never get to write that op-ed for the New York Times or anything that would be helpful, I think, on a broader scale to getting our message out there and getting support for the work that we do.
That's such a great point. And for some reason, that seems like a luxury, whereas it's really like a necessity, right? In communicating our message and building the tent, kind of educating both internally and externally, and but somehow that falls to the bottom of the to-do list. Yeah.
Did you ask me if there's something I wish I were doing less of?
Yes. There you go.
Okay.
What would you like to do less of?
All right. So I think I would like to do less fundraising.
Yeah.
I think over the years, funding for the work that we do, because we're not a direct provider, and it takes a lot of resources for us to do the outreach or, develop those relationships with the community-based organizations or other partners that we have to identify clients, get them the information, screen them for possible relief, and then find the pro bono counsel, make that connection, train them, support that process. And that is sort of what I like doing and I enjoy doing. And to sustain that work, it's really hard to fundraise, and it's not something I think I have had a lot of experience or I'm skilled in. But the funding for the work that we do has decreased dramatically. I think we're facing that a lot more in the future, and I think that's really challenging for us. And it sort of adds this layer of stress where you're like, oh, I could lose a staff member. We don't know if we can fund our work for another year. Like, that sort of anxiety doesn't help when you're already working in a field where there's a lot of really critical deadlines and priorities. So that's where I wish I could definitely not think about that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's definitely a great challenge of the work that many of us are doing. What other challenges can you identify about the work that you're doing, immigrants' work right now, Vols' work? Are there other sort of challenges that you see as the most immediate or even long-term that your work is facing?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it earlier, there's just not enough hours in the day.
Yeah.
So on a personal level, I think self-care, making sure my staff and I and my colleagues in the field are not on overdrive all the time, that we can sustain our efforts in the long haul. I think that, we're all talking about breathing more and all these different things, but I do, you're reading articles about therapists who are getting an uptick in just general anxiety across the country. And if you're on the front lines of this fight to try to, preserve the rights of individuals who are, really, disenfranchised, I think that is definitely increasing our anxiety. A lot of people that are in this work are usually empathetic or, are somehow, putting themselves emotionally out there a lot. And so I think that's a personal challenge that I'm trying to be really mindful of and make sure that, we're not going to burn out. Because I've seen a lot of colleagues in the last 10 years that do this work on overdrive for a couple years, and then they need to take a year off and drive across the country, and they're not, you know what I mean? Like, they have to step away. And we need everybody to be, taking care of themselves and, like, balancing all of those things. In terms of the work, getting a sustained commitment from people to take on the lower priority cases sometimes in a weird way. Like, I think you see a huge push when something is in the news. When you see that picture, that heartbreaking picture of a certain, demographic or some sort of issue, everybody wants to volunteer and do that stuff. And I think it tips this balance where everyone that wants to do pro bono wants to go to JFK, or everybody wants to work on this type of refugee for a few months, right? And then you flash forward a year later, and nobody wants to do those cases anymore because they've reached what they call a saturation point. And so I think that, we're looking at trying to serve the needs of a community that is literally under siege on a daily basis for the last month. And it feels like a lot longer already. And so to me, the harder work is really getting people to sign on to doing maybe complex cases or cases that take a long time, but that are not the high-profile cases, that don't necessarily seem directly connected to the hot pro bono thing that's happening in this moment. And to really think through that. And I know some of the pro bono partners that we have, they're managing those programs at their firms. And I know that we can have those conversations and that they are our partners. And I know a colleague of mine, I don't know if I should name firms, but at Simpson Thatcher, she was inundated with, lawyers who wanted to volunteer at certain places. She's like, we still have this other work. We have these cases that we want to place at these other nonprofits. And to me, taking any kind of case right now, especially if you don't have a deep expertise in an area that would require you to kind of be trained by a nonprofit, and that would be an investment in those resources. Taking a case that you can watch an online training through Pro Bono Net or some other vehicle, like through a nonprofit you're connected to, and sort of do that background work yourself and say, hey, I've done an asylum case a few years ago, or I've done a VAWA case or a U case or whatever the area of law is, and just helping the day-to-day person that still needs help. Those needs have not changed. And every person, especially in immigration, if we can move more people to security with their immigration status, that is one less person that might be at risk of removal. And so I think that's a challenge, to have those conversations and really ensure that the interest and the amazing effort to coordinate all those resources are sort of spread out so that they are not all focused in just one area that's of the moment.
That is a great point. And I think that's a conversation that our pro bono community has regularly, right? How do we balance the sexy and the trendy, the kind of matter of the moment, with, just for a lack of a better term, the bread and butter sort of daily needs of human beings, because humans aren't trends. they're people.
Right.
And we have to work on that so that it isn't an either or, but an and. Yes, we can do both. We can do it all. You touched on this a little bit, but what have you found works best to engage pro bono lawyers? What are your most successful pitches?
If I can do some sort of training or presentation to lawyers where I can share relatable stories about the impact of their work, I've been very lucky in some cases. I've often had more interest from volunteers than I've had cases to place. And I've been trying to balance that by reaching out to my colleagues at nonprofits and saying, hey, I have a bunch of pro bono lawyers who want to take some SIDG cases and we have capacity to mentor them. Do you have some that you haven't been able to place or you haven't even had time to think about? And so we're trying to coordinate behind the scenes to do that. So I think when I can share the stories of those cases, that's often been really helpful. And the support of pro bono counsel to promote those opportunities or projects has been very effective because they're really sort of the gatekeepers, at their firms. But another, I think, really motivating experience is I know that, we partner with a firm and a couple of firms, and our board members are partners at those firms. And they themselves have popped in and said hello during my training or come to one of the presentations and talked about why our organization or this project is important to them. So I think firms where the partners themselves do pro bono or are involved in pro bono and talk about the value of it. John Kiernan from Debevoise is an excellent example of having shown a lifelong commitment to pro bono. He teaches a course that talks about that. He's now, the New York City Bar Association president, so I think that firms that really incorporate pro bono into the firm culture, where it's not just, a requirement that associates have to find time to do, that it's really a deep commitment from the top to the bottom and everywhere in between and supported, I think that helps incentivize and engage lawyers, that it's not something that is going to take them away from what they have to do and their commitments in the day-to-day.
And I like the idea of ambassadors because it probably buoys your message and your being the messenger when you can stand sort of side by side, toe to toe with someone who's had a great pro bono experience, right? And you together are telling the story. That's a credible messenger, and
right. And I mean, we work in high schools, and so we have some really interesting interactions with some of our clients that when I talk about sharing those stories, the day-to-day work at a firm, I'm sure can be very exciting or very challenging, and it's not every day that one of your clients, your corporate clients, are going to fly into the room and go, hey, are you the lawyers that worked on my case? Because you guys rock. That, I'm sure, has never been said by somebody who is a client that that's what our teenagers will say. And I think people are drawn to the opportunity to interact in those ways and feel like their contribution is making an impact. And it doesn't have to be the big seminal class action. It can be just this individual and how that impacted their day. And just the expression of that, I think, is very motivating.
So in addition to, you rock, could you share some examples of pro bono cases that have been particularly meaningful to you, either that you've worked on or you've kind of been a part of or that you've witnessed, pro bono lawyers work on? Tell some stories.
Wow. Okay. There's definitely some interesting ones. The thing about immigration law is sometimes they take a really long time to sort themselves out. And so, I know we worked on one case that was meaningful for me because we tried something that I think was a little bit new. There was a provision that was new in the law. And so it was meaningful for me because we really impacted a person's life and took a little bit of a legal risk in doing that in terms of like advocating for something. But we had such a strong team that was willing to do that. And so in this case, this was a family. We met the young person at a school in the Bronx, and they had actually entered with a visa that doesn't even exist anymore, like a decade prior. And while they were waiting for their paperwork to finalize, and this was an old law that allowed, because the process took such a long time, there was a special visa that allowed you to come in and sort of wait your time after you've already been waiting for 2 years. And during that period of time, the sponsor, husband, petitioner died unexpectedly. And that automatically revoked this case. And so this mother and son should have theoretically left and gone back to the country that they were, citizens of, but, they had just undergone this trauma and they did not speak English. They didn't have access to any lawyers, and we met them, several years after the fact, where they had actually been defrauded by someone who filed this very bare bones application. At least it wasn't damaging, but it was not going to result in anything positive. And once we reviewed all the documentation, we saw that it hadn't been denied. It was just sort of in this no man's land of like adjudication. And so we started to really put together a better application, and we sought something called humanitarian reinstatement. And when we did that, there were some provisions that had been pending a regulation that had a sort of gray area, and this is where lawyers can really use their skills to identify ways to advocate when there is a new provision or a new area of law and shape how that law is going to be applied. And so, long story short, we were able to help this family reinstate this visa that was automatically revoked and allow them to obtain permanent residence and not have to leave after, being in here for a decade, and having sort of been living in fear this whole time. And so that was a very meaningful early case for me because I really saw how, a firm that may not have that expertise in a certain area but had the resources and the interest in supporting this case could work with myself, that where I don't have a large staff, and it would have been very difficult for me to devote all my time into working on this case, and how we can come together and correct this really egregious result of very unfair laws.
I think it's a great example, too, of how smart lawyers can figure things out and make a difference, right? Just you don't have to necessarily have immense background and experience. You're smart, and maybe coming at it at a new angle is actually a benefit. And then
it can be, yeah.
They have your expertise in mentoring, so it's a dynamite combination. I think that's a great story to share.
I mean, to me, that was a meaningful case, and I remember getting an invitation to this young man's performance in his school band, after he got his green card. And it just, there's a lot of things that I enjoy about the work that I do. My favorite is actually looking at everyone's baby pictures from their old passports. It's just this weird little highlight of my day often. But just hearing from people who you've worked with, and maybe you hear from them a few months later or a year later or 5 years later, and they share a little moment in their lives, and it's not an email or a communication that's filled with stress or worry. It's just like, hey, I'm doing this thing now, or I'm going on this trip, or I'm studying abroad and I never thought I could do that. And that's a meaningful result of the work that we're doing, and it's really positive and makes me want to try to ensure that more and more people can have those stories to share.
So we've danced around this a little bit, but I wanted to ask, what, if anything, has changed about your work since the election? And I should say that we're taping this on the 22nd of February, so it's completely possible that events and news will have passed this by.
Even today, yes, as we speak, there could be a new executive order or some other, I've been calling it a kick to the gut on a daily basis in terms of what we as lawyers have come to see as the rule of law and a respect for due process. I know that there are challenges, and, this has been an ongoing struggle to ensure that all people have a fair experience with the legal system. And, I do think that in terms of how the laws are targeting, particularly the population that I work with, it feels like everything has changed in some ways. Things that I thought I could rely on or know or have learned in the last decade have sort of been shaken upside down. When you see a tweet storm between the president and against the judiciary and the challenges that has to the fabric of what makes this country amazing, that to me is very demoralizing. And that's sort of the broad picture of what this work means right now for anyone that cares about the law. And I'm assuming most lawyers care about the rule of law and want to preserve those protections. And to see such a flagrant disregard for what those rights mean to people, and we're not even talking about the everyday abuses that people face or misinformation or unfairness that really, really happen. So I feel like we have to be super, super vigilant in terms of how we are looking at how every executive order, every memo, what's happening in Congress in terms of funding. There's just no area that we cannot be on top of or cognizant on. So in terms of just sheer volume and sheer amount of changes that have happened or are trying to be implemented in such a short time, it's really a shock to the system. And so that's sort of why I was touching on the self-care part of it. And I do think that the other thing that I'm seeing, though, is a huge effort to collaborate and develop coalitions across broad groups that you never saw weighing in on these issues in a way. So that is, encouraging. But it does speak to the profound changes that are happening in how we are utilizing and how the law is being used to target people who I think are often mischaracterized.
If you had a crystal ball, what do you think is going to happen? Where do you think this is going for the next 6 months, year, sort of forward? And what do you think your work will look like?
That's a question I've been thinking a lot about. And I spent a few months, initially I spent time contacting every client that we've had that sort of we felt could be a little bit more vulnerable under the new administration right after the election. So we sort of went in overdrive to get ahead of the pass, right? To let everyone know, whatever happens, we're starting to prepare now. And, kind of just letting everyone know, we've got your back. And so I think that was my first priority. And I think going forward, I need to sort of rethink our communication strategies to our clients. Because in the past, I didn't have to really go back to former clients in a way that I might now, right? Or usually it was we would hear from them when it was time to do a renewal for that temporary permission to stay in the country under Obama's executive order with DACA. And so, when we started those projects to work on those cases. It was a new program, and so we developed relationships with our clients. We weren't involved in really mass clinics, and we've really been trying to educate our clients. And so we're shifting into really ramping up our Know Your Rights presentations. But I do feel like Know Your Rights presentations as in and of themselves and as standalone events are not as effective if they are not coupled with one-on-one consultations to look into the possibilities of permanent relief, or knowing who to call and that you will have a lawyer that's going to stand by you if you are targeted for removal. And so I'm looking into how to ensure that the communities we serve are getting that message and that I can build up our resources to meet that need. And that's going to involve a lot of different steps. And so I've been having conversations with people determining who's doing certain areas of work, because we're such a small organization, we can't do all the things. And that's sort of been another change, like this idea that we're isolated or that we have to serve all these different needs of our clients. And we've always been very active in understanding who the other players are in this field in our communities here, and making appropriate referrals if we do feel other organizations might serve the needs of particular clients better than we could. Not every client's case is suitable for a pro bono relationship. They should be maybe at an organization that provides a more holistic approach. And so I think we're really trying to shore up all of the information of all the things that our clients are asking us about, who we can direct them to meet those needs, and what needs are most appropriate for us to do. Where's our expertise? And, how do we transition into doing more defensive work? Because in the past, we've been doing more affirmative work. And so that's sort of one of the things that obviously, we were preparing for, but not on the level that it seems that it's going to be necessary.
It's such a shifting landscape. I'll look forward to keeping in touch, and we'll find out. We'll check back in a few months and see where we are, see what's developed, and see what, if any, changes we've made. And I think it's the story is continuing and ongoing, so it's very much all a work in progress for sure.
Yes.
Okay, so Liz, let's end with this. Who's your pro bono role model and why? And feel free to share more than one.
I think on the firm side, I want to give a little shout out to Jennifer Collier Fried-Frank. To me, she feels sort of like an unsung hero in many ways. I've worked with her for a number of years, and her firm took on another really interesting case that we handled for the grandmother of a student at one of our schools, and she was his primary caregiver, and her son was serving in the military. And they helped her unravel like 30 years of immigration history and efforts to correct her status. Jennifer has developed a very deep knowledge of immigration law the hard way. She's taken really complex cases over the years and has never been It hasn't been sort of like a recent entree. It's been a long, sustained commitment to taking difficult cases and really doing the work. And I'm really impressed with, her commitment to this field and to supporting so many organizations that do a variety of immigration cases. And she's also like not the person who's like standing there and saying like, I'm an expert, but she really kind of is. So I really admire her.
It's great. That's a well-deserved tribute for sure.
I mean, there is a lot, there's so many other pro bono counsel that I've had the pleasure to work with. In my career, I feel like if I start to name a bunch of names, and I'm going to leave somebody out.
That's right. All inclusive. We'll say.
And I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings because I really have learned so much from so many of them in a variety. There's, from So I'm gonna stick with just the first name that came to mind because, I don't know if she's had the accolades that a lot of the other amazing people that have worked at a lot of these firms, both with me and with other colleagues, have. I think there's another pair on the legal services side that do pro bono management at their nonprofits, and that's Annie Pineda and Adam Heinz, and they're at Bronx Defenders and Lisney, and they started an effort, I think a little over a year ago, to coordinate pro bono, like individuals at nonprofits that work with pro bono, to help us collaborate and sort of learn from each other and work as a unit to sort of be a place of increasing the best practices in these relationships. And they've really shown a lot of leadership and helped me to develop my skill set and, work through some of the challenges that we face in this field. And so I found like their vision to develop this collaborative between PIPA, P-I-P-B-A, it's sort of a New York-focused group of pro bono counsel or individuals that maintain pro bono partnerships with firms, and I really have been admiring their leadership in that effort.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Those are wonderful choices, and thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been a pleasure.
It's really been a pleasure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share what we're doing and trying to do to a wider audience. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much to Liz for joining us today and for all the inspiring work that she does. You can learn more about VOLS by visiting their website, volsprobono.org. New and archived episodes of the podcast can be found on iTunes and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and please take a moment to leave an iTunes review. We'd appreciate the honest feedback, and it would help make it easier for other listeners to find the show. We'd love to hear from you. Send your comments, feedback, and suggestions to probono@probonoinst.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Pro Bono Happy Hour.